Hi, sweeties. How are you doing? Welcome to Naya Sim. And thank you all so much for all the love and support. Hope you all are doing great. So I came across this video. But before I get into this video, I am going to say that at YouTube, this video is a reaction video. And it is strictly for educational purposes. And this video doesn't have any intention to bully or harass anybody. With that being said, let's get into this video. So I remember that, this is not the first or second time that we have talked about how some certain things happen to Black community. And to this very moment, some people are still finding it hard to understand or to agree that they did so many outrageous things back then. Now, I keep saying this whatever that happened back then was not an accident. It was something that happened out of maybe just people being jealous or not liking people, or feeling that these people do not feel much pain, or it's just more like people not being human enough with one another, because what happened is something that nobody should ever do to any human being, right? Now, each time I look at most of the things that happen to people that look like me, and I talk about reparations, and some people will tell you that there is no need for reparations, I am not going to lie. After listening to all this, and you think that there is no need for reparations, then you are also part of the problem. And then each time I hear people talk about do not it's been years this thing happened and all that, let it go. I want you to know that it has not been so long ago. Let's get into.
Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So whenever I'm teaching an American history course, the lynching of Black Americans is one of the darkest and most upsetting chapters that I cover. It's almost impossible to imagine or comprehend the level of depravity and violence that was involved in these killings. And I honestly believe that when you bring an accurate discussion of lynching into the American story, you'll never be able to look at American history the same again. In order to have a factual and accurate discussion of lynching with my students, I've spent years researching lynchings, and I've read hundreds of accounts of lynchings from historical newspaper databases, and I would like to share some of the conclusions I found from my research with you. So, lynching describes the illegal murder of Black Americans by white mobs. There was no justice, no judge, no jury, no trial. This was public murder. But what were the reasons that the lynchers gave for these killings? How did they justify themselves? What were the supposed crimes that these Black Americans were being killed for? Now, during the time period, the lynchers often made the false accusation that they were killing an individual because they had assaulted a white woman. However, anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells did her own research and found that this was completely false, and that in the majority of lynching cases, the only crime that the Black individual had committed was being Black in a white supremacist society. However, protecting white women continued to be a popular explanation for lynchings. For example, Caleb Gadley was lynched in Kentucky in 1894 for walking behind the wife of his white employer. Keith Bowen was lynched in Mississippi in 1889 for accidentally entering and then leaving a room where 3 white women were. General Lee was lynched in South Carolina in 1904 for knocking on the door of a white woman's house. Thomas Miles was lynched in 1912 for inviting a white woman to go have a drink with him. Jeff Brown was lynched in 1916 for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. Parks Banks was lynched in Mississippi in 1922 for having the picture of a white woman in his possession. In 1889 in Loudon, Virginia, a Black 14-year-old named Orion Anderson was lynched by a mob of white men. What was his crime? He was playing with a white girl and he put on a mask and he scared her, and he was killed for it. In 1930, John Wilkins was lynched for smiling at a white woman on a train. Sometimes lynchings were the result of a Black American breaking some unwritten white supremacist rule. For example, Jesse Thornton was lynched in Alabama in 1949 for not saying Mr. as he talked to a white police officer. Some of the other reasons for lynchings were speaking disrespectfully to white people, arguing with a white person, insulting a white person, refusing to step off of the sidewalk to make way for a white person, or just standing around. It's clear that there never was any real crime associated with lynching. The crime that these people were being killed for was the crime of having black skin. So the next question becomes, who were the lynchers? And you might be surprised to learn that it was not racist terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, those groups did kill black Americans, but they were not responsible for the majority of lynchings. So who were the lynchers? The lynchers were doctors, teachers, grocers, businessmen, lawyers, parents, children, police officers. It was the entire community that was participating in these killings. There was nowhere to turn for help. You couldn't go to the authorities because the police officers were participating in the lynching. You can see from this photograph, the caption reads, "Lynching in action. State troopers and citizens of Gordonsville, Virginia formed a posse of 1,000 which fired for 6 hours on the cabin of a 65-year-old Negro worker and his sister. They finally burned the hovel and both victims." It's ironic that when the bodies of lynching victims were brought to the morgue, they often wrote under cause of death, "death at the hands of persons unknown." But that is a complete lie. They knew exactly whose hands had done it because it was the entire community. Just look at these mugshots from individuals that were involved in a lynching in South Carolina in 1947. All of the men in this picture participated in that lynching, and not a single individual was charged with a crime. Here's another article from 1943. The headline reads, "These men might ordinarily pass for decent citizens." However, all of these individuals had recently taken part in a lynching. And when people were asked to describe what these men were like, here's what they said. "These are some of the best men in the county. Men who are considered here to be the best representatives in the community of law, order, and justice. They called these men good Christians. They called them the best citizens." The lynchers were not seen as monsters, but upstanding members of the community. They were not treated as pariahs or social outcasts because everyone in the community was participating in these killings. The next point to emphasize is that lynchings were not spontaneous acts of violence that were committed in a fit of rage. These were organized, planned events that were attended by thousands of people. Usually a lynching victim was kept for a few days, sometimes in a jail cell or held in another location, and this gave the lynchers time to advertise the event. You can see here from this newspaper ad, the date, the time, the location of lynchings was widely distributed in order for more people to come and participate in this killing. And sometimes people drove across state lines. They would travel hundreds of miles in order to watch these murders take place. Lynchings were usually held on weekends, so more people could attend. However, if they were held on a weekday, all of the businesses would close down so their employees could go watch the lynching, and all of the schools would also close down. They would ring the bells, and all of the students would walk out in a single file, and their teachers and parents would take them to these lynchings. And when they got there, they would hear musicians playing music, and they would find vendors selling snacks and drinks. Now, these lynchings were not done under the cover of dark in the middle of the woods. They were done in public, in broad daylight, in the middle of Main Street, on the public square, sometimes even on the courthouse lawn. Now, if you look at this photograph, you would never know that these people are going to a lynching. These individuals are flocking to go watch a public murder take place in broad daylight in America. If you look at this photograph, you would never know that what these individuals are all straining to see is a lynching, the killing of a Black American. If you were to look at this photograph with no context, it looks like a carnival or a concert, and that is exactly the type of atmosphere that lynchings had. People were not ashamed to take part and to watch these lynchings. These were nights that these individuals wanted to remember. That's why usually during all lynchings, there were professional photographers that were taking pictures of the killings and turning them into postcards. And they were also taking pictures of individuals that were there that wanted to commemorate and remember this night. If you look at this picture and you see the faces of these individuals, it's very hard to imagine that just right off the screen are 3 young black teenagers that have been brutally killed. This is a picture of a lynching that took place in Florida in 1935. And this is a young girl watching an individual be killed right in front of her eyes. And I want you to look at her face and look at the smile on her face. The fact that a young girl could watch a black American be brutally killed right in front of her and then smile while looking at that dead body shows you just how much black Americans had been dehumanized. And it shows you how much white America was desensitized to this violence. To accurately tell the story of American history, this level of violence has to be brought back into the main narrative. We are never going to be able to move forward as a nation or a people until we finally deal with the legacy of this violence. Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So the other day I posted a video talking about the very important topic of the lynching of black Americans by white mobs in this country in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I wanted to make another video going into the origin of the word lynching and talking about the definition and statistics. If you've ever been driving down the highway in Virginia and you've seen Lynchburg, that is the Lynch family, and it is one of those family members, Charles Lynch, where we get the word lynching from. Charles Lynch was a slave owner in Virginia, and during the American Revolution, he created his own local militia. And what they would do is they would go out and look for British loyalists or Tories that were still loyal to the British king, and they would attack, assault, and punish these individuals, most often by tying them to a tree and having them whipped. So this was basically mob violence. There was no jury, no judge, no trial, no law. This was just Charles Lynch and his gang going out and finding these loyalists and violently assaulting them, sometimes even hanging them. So word started to spread about Charles Lynch and his method of treating loyalists, and people started saying things like lynch law and calling him Judge Lynch. So the word lynching did not originally begin as a term to describe racist violence. It began in the context of the American Revolution. Now, fast forward to the 1800s. When slavery ended in the 1860s, white Americans started terrorizing and murdering black Americans to show them that even though they were no longer enslaved, they would never really be true Americans. They could never feel safe and comfortable in this country. And as these illegal mob killings of black Americans spread, people started resurrecting that word lynch law and Judge Lynch, and eventually that got shortened to lynchings. So when we use this word lynching, what we are describing is racial terrorism. And if we look at the statistics, that is exactly what we see. From 1865 to 1965, 6,500 to 10,000 black Americans were lynched. And even though other racial groups were targeted and killed, such as Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, even though these individuals were also lynched, if we look at the numbers, 72% of all recorded lynchings were black Americans, even though they only represented 12% of the U.S. population. So this was racial terrorism targeted against black Americans. 72% of all lynchings were targeted at the black community. In places like Georgia, 95% of all recorded lynchings were against black Americans. These numbers are really important, and it's important to be accurate when we're talking about lynching, because we can still see people making a false both sides equivalency. For example, in 2019, Republican Colorado State Representative Lori Sain made this incorrect statement. She said, "We have come a long way since the Reconstruction days, since whites and blacks alike were in nearly equal numbers lynched for the crime of being Republican." That is absolutely incorrect. White Americans and black Americans were in no way, shape, or form lynched at equal levels. Lynching was racial terrorism directed against the black community by white Americans. So this word is very specific, and it's important to have an accurate understanding of what it means. It's also important to recognize that lynching was a constant feature across American history for over 100 years. From 1883 to 1922, there were no less than 50 lynchings of black Americans every year. In the 1890s, every single year of that decade, there was over 100 lynchings of black Americans, with the worst year being 1892 that saw 161 killings. It took until 1936 for the lynching of black Americans to get under 10 a year. And this is probably the most important piece of data connected to lynchings. 99% of the lynchers were never charged with a crime. So this was killing without consequence. This was American terrorism. This is why it infuriates me when I hear the word lynching being used in a metaphorical context or an analogy. People talking about political lynchings, such as Donald Trump comparing his impeachment to a lynching. And Joe Biden has done the same thing. He's also used words like political lynching. As we've seen, lynching is a word with a very specific meaning. It is racial terrorism that was directed against the black community by white Americans. And it's something that is not talked about enough, and we need to talk about more. Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So recently I've been posting a lot of videos about one of the most upsetting and violent parts of American history, which is the lynching of black Americans by white mobs. And I've talked about the origins of the word lynching, the statistics we have on how many black Americans were lynched, and most recently I talked about who were the lynchers. Now I want to talk about one of the most difficult parts of this topic, which is that lynchings were not about the killing of an individual. Lynchings were about terrorizing the entire black community. And the main form that this terrorism took was by burning black Americans alive at the stake. Now, I definitely want to provide a trigger warning because what I'm about to discuss is extremely violent and can be traumatizing. And believe me, I know how hard it is to hear this information. After I gave my first lecture on lynching, when everyone left the room, I collapsed and just started bawling my eyes out. I had no idea how much this information had impacted me. However, I strongly believe that these are the type of stories that we have to keep telling and we have to remember because there's people that are actively trying to erase this history. So before I started researching lynchings, I had this idea that lynchings were just public hangings. I had no idea that black Americans were being burned alive at the stake. This is something in my mind that I associated with hundreds of years ago and things like the Spanish Inquisition and the witch trials. However, then I came across this NAACP flyer from 1922, which reads, "The shame of America. Do you know that the United States is the only land on earth where human beings are burned at the stake?" They go on to mention that from 1918 to 1921, 28 black Americans were publicly burned by white mobs. I really couldn't believe what I was reading, but as I did more research, what I found is that lynchings involved public burnings as often as they did public hangings. And often when an individual was hung, they were then cut down and then burned, sometimes for days afterwards. As I did research in historical newspaper databases, I was continually shocked to see how common these stories were. For example, I kept coming across headlines like these: "Burn a Negro at stake in Pennsylvania, tries to escape when burned loose, but is thrust back with pitchforks." Mob burns Negro at stake. Mob burns captive at stake in Georgia. Negro boy tortured and burned at stake. Eager to burn Negro. Tennessee Negro dies at the stake. 3,000 will burn Negro. Negro is burned to death by mob as scores look on. Burning Black Americans was so common in the United States that Booker T. Washington could make this observation in 1904. Within the last fortnight, 3 members of my race have been burned at the stake, one of these a woman. In the midst of the nation's busy and prosperous life, few, I fear, take time to consider where these brutal and inhuman practices are leading. The custom of burning human beings has become so common as scarcely to excite interest or attract unusual attention. As I continued to do research, what I found is that the burning of Black Americans had become normalized into American life, and it's something that lasted for decades. Here's a headline from Arkansas in 1892, which reads, "A Negro burned alive, roasted alive in the presence of 1,000 people. The act of an Arkansas mob. Ed Coy protested his innocence. He was recognized by Mrs. Jewell. She applied the torch herself." Here's a headline from 1899, which reads, "Negro dies at the stake, burned by a Georgia mob. His body cut in many pieces." This headline reveals an ugly truth about lynchings, is that they often involve the torture and mutilation of Black bodies. If we look at other reports, we can see that the lynchers often wanted to take body parts from their victims as souvenirs. In 1899, we can read how Sam Hose is lynched. Georgia mob chain and burn Negro at tree, remains cut up as souvenirs. Here's a similar report from 1901, which reads, "Toes taken from fire to keep as souvenirs." Another important fact to remember is that it was not only Black men that were being lynched. Black women and children were also lynched. For example, in 1900, a Colorado mob burned a Black 16-year-old named Preston Porter. As we move further into the 20th century, we can see that these public burnings did not stop, they increased. Here are 2 headlines from 1905, with one describing how a Black man was made into a living torch. Sometimes these spectacles of violence involve the killings of several people, such as this 1906 headline which reads, "Mob burns 3 Negroes at stake." In 1908, we can read this headline about how a Black man named Ted Smith was burned in the public square in Greenville, Texas. During the lynching, there were professional photographers taking photographs that would later be turned into postcards, and you can see here they're taking a picture of the bonfire before the individual is publicly burned. A few years after the killing of Ted Smith, we find another public burning in Texas. This 1912 headline reads, 2,000 see a man burned, lynching Negro at Tyler, Texas. The following year, another burning took place in Arkansas, and we can see the paper describing how mob hangs and burns, Negro put to death in street at Hot Springs, Arkansas, tourist horror-stricken. In 1918, a photographer snapped a photo of a group of lynchers that had just burned a Black man alive, and you can see that they labeled this photograph the Omaha Lynching Party. Even into the 1920s, we can continue to see these public burnings taking place. In 1922, we can read about how boy 15 tortured over slow fire, crying victim then dragged into road, flame rekindled at stake, burning body made target for bullets, mob now seeks another to be lynched. I think the most important fact to remember about these public burnings of Black Americans is that they were attended by thousands of people. This is something that the white community wanted to see. As we can see from this drawing that was done that the artist labeled her first lynching. We can see a mother holding up her daughter in order to get a better view of a Black man being burned alive. Like I've mentioned before, lynching was not done by individuals. It took a community and a culture to commit these acts of violence. This is the exact point that a preacher made in 1917 after a Black man named L. Persons was lynched in Tennessee. The day after the killing, the preacher said, "We burned a Negro at the stake yesterday. let us underscore the word we. So if we are proud of it, let us be proud of it together. If we are ashamed of it, let us be ashamed of it together. Let's not be cowardly enough to put it off onto someone else, claiming that we were at home attending to business. Public opinion burned persons, the minister of the gospel, the lawyer, the doctor, the newspaper editor, the man who talks to others on the street corner or the streetcar. He shared in it. That is, he did unless he protested. And there were few protests. The majority approved. The minority kept silent. And silence gives consent. I firmly believe that if historians don't tell these stories and give an accurate representation of the American past, that silence is consent to the continuation of white supremacy and racism. These stories have to continue to be told because silence gives consent.
This is all I got from this video, and I am not sure this is new, but I love it when they also share part of the things they participated in, right? And also, I am sure that they listen to themselves most times, because when we talk about it, it's always like, we love to bring old things away, and then they want to remind you how you are talking about something that happened years back. Now, to think of, to think that some people actually did all this just because they probably were not comfortable with other people, or just because they just do not want you around. All these are the things that they did to people that look like me. And each time we talk about reparations with all our hearts, some of them are very quick to come out to tell us that that we never experienced anything, or it was back in the days, it was years ago, it was many years ago, because they are always very proud to say it. But now let me tell you something. For somebody to make a postcard, anything that happened and there is a postcard. Now, let me tell us something. When you are about to do a wedding, people always send out invites. The invite is to let people know that you are doing something. And I always feel like when you send invites out to people, it means that you know what you are doing and you have acknowledged that this thing is going to happen. But this is also me inviting you over to come and participate or come and be part of what is going on. So it is not unplanned something. Majority of them are planned from what he listed. And, it just all the time, they always look for an excuse to unalive somebody. You can imagine just mistakenly knocking at somebody's door and also walking away, like you knocked on somebody's door and you're like, sorry, this is not where I'm supposed to be. And you walked away, and they still looked for a way to unalive the person. See, each time I talk about reparations and somebody says that there is no need for reparations, I want you to know that you all are also part of the problem. And when we talk about reparations, I want you to know that reparation is not only for slavery. There were so many other things that happened during slavery and after slavery. So I am not talking about only slavery, because Black people went through it all. What is it you want to talk about that they did not experience? So am I going to talk about ghetto bait and all that? All these things were the things that happened to them. And till this very moment, it's really very sad that till this very moment, they are dancing around. Are we going to pay this reparations, or are we not going to pay this reparations? Please cut that check, because this is not something you need to think. And I remember, I think there was a video somebody made. There are sometimes I record videos and I cannot talk about everything, because sometimes I make a very long video, probably trying to dissect the whole thing. I might end up not getting all the point. That dawned on me now. So the man was talking about, instead of our government paying reparations, maybe they can pay tuition fee for some people, $10,000 and all that, for some people's tuition fee just to go through school and all that. Instead of people, see, let me tell us something. $10,000 is not money, because it cannot send somebody to school, especially when you're in college I know people that paid more than how many $1,000, 50, some are in debt, like, to this very moment. So $10,000, I ain't doing anything, or telling me that, yeah, $10,000 can do something for somebody. And also, if you are for those that are encouraging everybody, like the man was talking about reparation, it was like $10,000 would be okay to, like, to give people and all that, or maybe just send every Black person to school. The truth is that everybody doesn't want to go to school, because some people, maybe their own destiny is to be traders and all the entrepreneurs and all that. So everybody mustn't go to school. And I am also of the opinion that if you know that entrepreneurship is your side, you just like focus on that aspect. Make sure you are enlightened in the aspect that you will look for a way to like do business education or something that can profit you in the sector that you are going into, right? So now coming back. From everything that happened, you all can see that most of the things that happened to people that look like me were just something that it was just out of them probably not wanting you around, or doesn't want to be with you, or just feel like you all are not human enough to be around us, because when we talk about this race of a thing, you find that we did not create race, right? It is all of a sudden that they made it known that we are black people, or Black Americans, these Americans and all that. Why? Because they feel like there is need to distinguish everybody from one another, right? This was not our idea, and that was their idea. So all this that I look around, I looked at, and I am like, my people really went through it. You can imagine. See, I really do not want to process the pains, because I know what it means to probably you are cooking as a woman or as anybody, and mistakenly you touch a hot pot. You are absolutely dying and waking up at the same time. Like I am, you are in pains, you are going through it. Then imagine when somebody is put somewhere, See, they really have so much. When I say so much, they owe Black people so much. And for those that wake up and talk about it, they do not owe Black people any reparations. See, you all are part of the problem, because what they even owe Black people, I am not sure that they can pay them everything they owe them, because they owe them so much for the pains, for so many things. I cannot, Black history is one of those history that is like very, very sad to talk about. But I am just going to cut it here. See you all in my next video. Bye for now.